What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be going over my Season 6 Tornado build here in Mobalytics that I like to call the Big Bad Wolf, or BBW for short. Now, where this might not be the best Druid build this season, it is a build that a lot of Druid players love to play. And I think I've made a pretty decent setup here for you guys if you would like to try out a Tornado build this season. Now, before we get into the build, I did want to go ahead and mention to you guys that all of the builds I've made this season are down in the description below. And I also want to say that this will probably be my very last Druid build video I make for this season, but I will have other videos coming out, and I will be covering the PTR as well as PoE 2 when that launches. However, if you guys have any requests whatsoever that are not Cataclysm or Hurricane, because I absolutely hate those builds, go ahead and post them down in the comments section. Again, it has to be a Druid build, and I will go ahead and make that planner when I have time and link it to you directly through your comment. But now that we've gotten all that out of the way, let me go ahead and pop up some gameplay footage on the screen and go over this build. So the first thing I want you guys to notice is that there are two variations for this build, one softcore and one hardcore. And I am building this out in hardcore, and I haven't had a lot of time to dedicate to this build. So all the current gameplay footage you're seeing is without maxing anything at all on this character, including glyphs. So if you are a hardcore player like I am, go ahead and check out this hardcore BBW setup because I guarantee you will not be disappointed. But anyway, let's go ahead and go over the skills. So for our primary skill, we're going to be using Tornado, followed by Maul, and that's really just to keep up all of our quick shift buffs. Then we're going to be using Petrify for our ultimate, followed by our Blood Howl, and this again is to help keep up our defensive buffs, especially that defensive damage buff we got this season. And then we're going to be using Cyclone for a little bit more damage reduction. However, this is a flex spot for you guys if you want to choose something different. By all means, go ahead and do it. And then last but not least, we're going to be using Debilitating Roar. Now, before moving on, I did want to go ahead and let you guys know the reason why I do not have any form of Unstoppable on my skill bar. And that is because I'm using Impairment Reduction to mitigate crowd control effects on this build. Now, I know this is not something you guys are used to playing around with, but I think it's being overlooked this season, and I think if you try it out, you might actually like it as much as I do. But let's go ahead and move on to our Spirit Boons. So for our Spirit Boons, we are using Wariness on the Deer. On the Eagle, we're using Iron Feather as well as Avian Wrath. Then for the Wolf, we're going to be using Energize to help with our resources. And last but not least, on the Snake, we're using Calm Before the Storm to cool down our Petrify that much faster. Now moving on to the aspects and uniques of the build, I did want to go ahead and mention that down in this text box, much like my Lightning Storm video I released yesterday, that there are choices if you do not have these mythic uniques, but because we are so far into the season, I'm choosing to build this setup with mythic uniques instead of the regular uniques first. So for our helmet, we're using Tempest Roar. On our chest piece, we're using the Shroud of False Death for the +1 to all passives, as well as that big chunk of max life. Then for our gloves, we're running the Storm Chasers aspect, and this is the aspect that got a really nice 50% multiplicative damage buff with this last patch they put through for the mid-season update. Then for our pants, we're using the Exploiters aspect. On our boots, we're using Wild Heart because we will be using the Bestial Rampage key passive. For our weapon, we're using the aspect of Retaliation. On our amulet, we're going to be using the aspect of the Unsatiated. Then for our first ring, it's going to be the Ring of Starless Skies. And then for the last ring, it's going to be the Hunter Zenith ring. And the reason why we're using this so much this season is because they changed the passive effect of this ring, which basically allows you to have a guaranteed crit overpower on any build you're using that shapeshifts, which pretty much all of the builds this season for the Druid that are really good are shapeshift builds. Now moving on to our gear affixes. So for the Tempest Roar, we're going to be prioritizing ranks to Wild Impulses. On our Shroud of False Death, we're going to prioritize Maximum Life. On our gloves, we're looking for a greater affix to ranks to Tornado and prioritizing that, as well as max life and critical strike chance. For our temp rings, we're going to be looking for Storm critical strike chance, as well as a lucky hit chance to freeze or stun your enemies. Moving on to our pants, we're going to be looking for a GA to armor to cap out the armor with this build. Then we're going to pick up any resistance that you need that isn't cold or lightning resistance, which you get from your Wild Heart boots and your Tempest Roar. So for me, it was fire resistance. This can be shadow resistance or poison resistance for you guys. And then we're going to be looking for max life, which you're going to prioritize that with your Masterworks. And then for the temp rings, it's going to be total armor as well as some petrify duration. Onto the Wild Heart boots, we're going to prioritize ranks to heightened senses, and this is where you're going to be getting the majority of your survivability with this setup. Then for our weapon, that's going to be a two-hand mace. However, if you want more attack speed, go with the two-hand staff, or if you want more vulnerability damage, go with a two-hand polearm, or if you don't have a really good two-hand mace, those two options are perfectly fine for this build. And then we're going to be looking for willpower, max life, and critical strike damage, with a GA to max life or willpower being perfectly fine for the setup. And I did want to go ahead and mention that if you want to swap out the critical strike damage for overpower damage, that's perfectly fine as well. And then for our tip rings, we're going storm critical strike chance as well as chance for tornado projectiles to cast twice, and prioritizing that for our masterworks. Now moving on to the amulet, and this is going to be pretty much like every single amulet you use on the Druid this season outside of like a Border Cane build. And what we're going to be looking for is a greater affix to ranks 2 and Venom, and prioritizing that with your masterworks. And then we're grabbing up willpower as well as ranks to quick shift. And then for our temp rings, we're using more storm critical strike chance. However, if you are overcapped on your critical strike chance with this build, go ahead and swap this out for a petrifying cooldown reduction or some more overpower or critical strike damage here. And then for our last tempering, it is going to be a defensive total armor tempering again, just to cap out your armor. Now moving on to our Ring of Starless Skies, we're looking for a greater affix to attack speed. However, a greater affix to core skills is perfectly fine as well. And then we're going to be prioritizing attack speed as much as we can. However, if you do find yourself getting more crits to core skills, that's perfectly fine for the setup too. And then last but not least, for our Hunter Zenith Ring, and this is really the only difference between the softcore and hardcore build, that's pretty substantial. So for the softcore build, we're going to be looking to grab up a GA2 ranks to quick shift and then critting that with our masterworks as much as possible. Now, if you are playing in hardcore, it is really beneficial if you grab a GA to ranks to heightened senses and then crit that a few times instead of quick shift, because what will happen is you'll have so much damage reduction from your heightened senses passive that you will basically become invincible to any content in the game. So it is a very easy way to provide yourself with survivability in hardcore, and then you can start kind of bringing down your survivability and going into more damage as you feel more comfortable with this build. Now moving on to our rune word. So for our first rune word, we're going to be using Tam and Yom. And that's just so that way we can keep up our Petrify consistently with this build. Now I will go ahead and mention that this is a bit of a flex spot here as well. So if you are looking to push pits or farm pits really fast, one of the best swaps for the Yom rune is a Kree rune to give you that vortex to help condense all the trash packs, all the mobs that are in the first part of your pit runs. And it just helps burn those things down a lot faster, so that way you can spend most of your time focusing on the boss. And then for our second rune word, that's going to be the Lift and the Quas rune to get that double damage tornado, which is really, really good for this build, especially if you manage to get it set up onto your overpower crit from your Hunter Zenith ring. Now, I would recommend to not try to make it happen all the time. Just let it happen organically as you play. You'll have a lot more fun that way. And honestly, I don't think this build would really function that well if you did try to sync up your double damage with your overpower crits every single time you had the Quas rune activated. Then for our gems, we're using Sapphires in the armor, an Amethyst in the amulet, an emerald in the first ring, and then a skull in the second ring. Now, I will go ahead and mention again that these two gems, your amethyst and your emerald, may be completely different for your build depending on what elemental resist you need that you did not get on your pants. So do not be tied to this. If you're missing fire resist because you have shadow resistance on your pants, go ahead and slot in a ruby instead. Now moving on to the skill tree. So for our basic skills, we're using Maul as well as Enhanced Maul. Then on our core skill tree, we're going 1 point Heart of the Wild into 3 points Wild Impulses, followed by 5 points Tornado into Raging Tornado for the source of vulnerability. Then we're picking up 1 point Predatory Instinct into 3 points Iron Fur. On our defensive tree, we're going 1 point Cyclone into Preserving Cyclone for the added damage reduction. Then we're grabbing 1 point Ancestral Fortitude and 3 points Vigilance. Then we're also picking up 3 points Backlash. Then we're going 1 point Bloodhowl into Preserving Bloodhowl. Now, if you are having resource issues, which I personally do not have with this setup, go ahead and swap Preserving Bloodhowl into Innate Bloodhowl until you get more comfortable, and then you can swap it back for that added attack speed. And then last but not least, we're using 1 point Debilitating Roar into Innate Debilitating Roar, which was changed this season to give us a nice damage buff. Onto our companion skill tree, we're going to be picking up 3 points into Feral Aptitude. Then onto our Wrath skill tree, we're using 1 point Neurotoxin into 3 points in Venom. For our ultimate skill tree, we're going 1 point Petrify into Supreme Petrify. Then we're going 3 points Defiance, 3 points Natural Disaster, 3 points Resonance, as well as 3 points Circle of Life. Now, if you do not need these 3 points for your survivability, go ahead and remove them and put them somewhere that you would prefer. I personally would go ahead and put them into Petrify just to reduce the cooldown a little bit more. Then we're going to be using 3 points Defensive Posture as well as 3 points Unrestrained. And again, I just want to go ahead and mention that because we're not using any source of Unstoppable, we're instead building out our impairment reduction as our source to mitigate crowd control effects on our character. And then last but not least, the MVP of the entire season, we're going 3 points Quick Shift into 3 points Heightened Senses. And then finally, for our key passive, it is going to be Bestial Rampage. Now moving on to the Paragon board, I just want to bring you guys' attention to the text box. I go ahead and put down here what you guys should prioritize first as you're going through your Paragon board, so that way you have a very comfortable time on this build. So for our first Paragon board, we're going to be slotting in the Earth and Sky glyph here. Then moving on to our second Paragon board, that's going to be Thunderstruck, and we're socketing in the Outmatch glyph here, as well as picking up the Legendary Node Thunderstruck. Now, I do want to go ahead and mention that you guys will have plenty of damage to close or damage to distant enemies to cap out this node, and you will not be required to use Territorial on this setup, so do not worry. You will have the complete 60% multiplicative damage from this legendary node with this setup. Then onto our third board, that's going to be the Lust for Carnage board. We're socketing in the Fang and Claw glyph here so we can maximize the critical strike damage from these magic nodes, and then we're also going to be picking up the legendary node Lust for Carnage. Now again, I just want to go ahead and bring your attention here. So the fleeting rare node as well as all of the magic nodes are a great way to boost up your impairment reduction, and I highly recommend picking these up if you are going to try out this impairment reduction setup, because if you do not pick those up, you will not be able to maximize the amount of impairment reduction you have, and you'll feel like you're being crowd controlled forever. Now moving on to our fourth board, that is the Heightened Malice board, and we are socketing in the Spirit glyph here, and we are going to pick up the legendary node Heightened Malice so we get that extra damage when we have 3 or more poison enemies surrounding our character. And then last but not least, our fifth board, that is the Ancestral Guidance board, and we're going to be socketing in the Dominate glyph here, as well as picking up the legendary node Ancestral Guidance to give us even more multiplicative damage. Now moving on to the Mercenary for this setup, like I always tell you guys, use whatever Mercenary you prefer. I personally like Subo for softcore because of the benefit from his Mercenary perk, and then I like to use right here for hardcore, again because he has a really nice Mercenary perk that helps you out a lot in hardcore. And then from there I go into Wire Trap, followed by Ready at Hand, and then I pick up Cover Fire as well as Opening Fire for that multiplicative critical strike damage bonus. And then for our reinforcement, I'm going to be using Aldakin and Field of Languish. Another great reinforcement Mercenary is Varyana with her Bloodthirst ability. But that's really for the video, guys. That is my Season 6 Tornado build, and it has been a lot of fun putting all of these builds together for you guys this season. And like I said, do not forget, if you do have any requests for the Druid class specifically that does not include Cataclysm or Hurricane, because I absolutely hate those builds, go ahead and post it down in the comments section, and I will try to build that planner out for you and then link it to you directly in the reply. But other than that, if you have any other questions, again, go ahead and post them down in the comments section. And like I said at the beginning of the video, I will be continuing to post out content for Diablo 4. I will be covering the PTR, and I'll also be covering the early access launch of Path of Exile 2, which I am incredibly excited to try out. I'm really looking forward to that extra difficulty that Path of Exile 2 offers as opposed to Diablo 4. And I will be covering the Druid class when it is finally released in Path of Exile 2, just like I covered the Druid in Diablo 4. However, because it will not be available at the very start of the game, I will be trying to build a monk, probably some kind of holy monk, because that sounds like a really cool idea to me. But as always, guys, I really appreciate all of your support, and thank you for engaging with my content. And I hope you guys are having a great day or a great night, depending on wherever you're from. And peace out, guys. I will see you in the next one.